The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. is our nation's memorial to victims of the Holocaust, and we seek to honor the memory of those who suffered in the Holocaust by acting against genocide and threats of genocide today. Hi, I'm Jerry Fowler from the Holocaust Museum's Committee on Conscience. For over 2 years, we at the Committee on Conscience have been confronting the crisis in the Darfur region of Western Sudan. Yet hundreds of thousands of civilians have perished, millions have been driven from their homes, and as I speak to you today, lives are hanging in the balance. We need to do more. When we teach about the Holocaust, one thing that we emphasize is that just because something happened doesn't mean that it was inevitable. The Holocaust was not inevitable. It was the product of choices made by many people, including bystanders. Likewise, what will happen in Darfur after today is not inevitable. It will be the product of choices that are still being made. Choices that are being made on the ground in Darfur itself and in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum, but also choices that are being made here in Washington, D.C., and in capitals around the world. And those choices are influenced in turn by choices that we as citizens make of whether to speak out or to remain silent. Many citizens will be gathering here in Washington on April 30th on the National Mall, in San Francisco at the Golden Gate Bridge, and in cities around the nation to raise their voices on Darfur. To help inform your choice, the Holocaust Museum is pleased to present today's discussion. What will it take to end the genocide in Darfur?
Good evening and welcome to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. and to this special live Internet event. I'm James Rosen, Washington correspondent for Fox News and your moderator this evening, but you too have a role to play. You can offer your own questions about the crisis in Darfur by visiting www.ushmm.org. Then /stop-genocide. Now, some 20 months have passed since then Secretary of State Colin Powell declared that the Sudanese government and its Arab militia allies, known as the Janjaweed, were engaged in an active program of genocide against non-Arab populations in that region. In the past 2 years, some 300,000 people have been killed, another 2 million displaced. Yet the crisis continues and by most accounts has actually worsened in recent months. So what will it take to end the atrocities in Darfur? For insight and answers tonight, we're joined by a distinguished panel. Ambassador Michael Ranneberger is Senior Representative for Sudan at the State Department. He has been instrumental in crafting and executing day-to-day policy on Sudan at the State Department for the past 2 years. Dr. Mudawi Ibrahim Adam is a Sudanese human rights activist and head of SUDO, the Sudan Development Organization, which operates a peace-building and reconciliation project in Darfur. He has also been jailed numerous times by the Sudanese authorities and, on the brighter side, recently enjoyed an audience with President Bush. Jon Sawyer is an award-winning journalist who directs the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. He recently traveled through Darfur with the African Union Monitoring Force and has produced a documentary chronicling his trip. At various points in our program, we will screen portions of that documentary. And last but not least, we have Samantha Power, who has been to Darfur and reported extensively on the conflict. Her book, A Problem from Hell, America in an Age of Genocide, was the winner of the 2002 Pulitzer Prize. She is a lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and presently serves as Foreign Policy Fellow in the office of Senator Barack Obama, Democrat of Illinois. First, for an overview of the situation in Darfur and a look at the roots of the crisis, we turn to an excerpt from Jon Sawyer's documentary.
Look closely and you notice something eerie and sad, that in village after village there are no people. Many of these remote hamlets have been burned or abandoned, mute testament to a willful bloodletting that has taken the lives of over 200,000 Sudanese and driven 10 times that number from their homes. In 2003, when the long marginalized region of Darfur erupted in rebellion, it appeared at first as merely a sideshow. Negotiations were then nearing completion on a settlement to end the equally brutal war that the country's Arab Muslim rulers had waged for 2 decades on non-Muslim African tribes in southern Sudan. American and UN officials gambled that pressing ahead with the North-South Accord would resolve the Darfur issue too. They were wrong. Khartoum responded to the Darfur rebellion by unleashing a paramilitary force of Arab tribes known as Janjaweed. Their mandate? To burn the villages of the region's African tribes, also Muslim, to kill the men, rape the women, steal the cattle, abduct the children. Some say Janjaweed attacks are closely coordinated with Khartoum. Others that Khartoum has long since lost control. Either way, the result is the same: disaster for the people of Darfur.
The latest wire reports today reflect the spread of this crisis across the border into neighboring Chad, with threats by that country's government to forcibly expel the estimated 200,000 Sudanese refugees who have fled there. That raises the question of responsibility that nations besides Sudan, neighbors or otherwise, bear in this situation. And it's natural enough that people around the world might look to the United States, the world's only remaining superpower, for action. I wonder, however, at the outset here, if there's anybody on this panel who would quarrel with the proposition that it is not the United States or any other large power that's observing the situation, whether from near or afar, that has chief culpability for these atrocities and crimes, but actually the perpetrators on the ground. Is there anyone who would quarrel with that proposition? Samantha or anybody? Okay. So now that we have defined that the United States does not bear chief responsibility for these crimes, Ambassador Ranneberger, if I could start with you first in a word, and by a word I mean yes or no, is it the policy of the United States government that genocide is still occurring in Darfur as we speak?
Yes, it is.
All right. What should the role of a superpower, of this superpower, be in such a crisis? And what grade, honestly, would you give the Bush administration right now?
Yeah. Well, you know, the Genocide Convention, which was passed after the Holocaust, as you know, does call on member states to take action in the UN Security Council. And what I would say about the United States response is that as soon as this became evident as a major crisis, we took the lead in mobilizing an international effort to exert pressure on Khartoum, to get African Union forces into Darfur to try to stop the violence with responsibility to help protect civilians, and to get a viable peace process started to resolve the conflict politically as well.
And we have a peace agreement that's been in place since January of 2005 between the North and the South in Darfur, but that has not necessarily stopped the killing. Samantha Power, you've written a book about America's responses or failure to respond to genocides over the course of the 20th century. How would you rate the United States response so far to this genocide?
Well, I think American citizens, students, church groups, Islamic groups, human rights organizations have learned a really important lesson from the 20th century, which is that you've got to put sustained political pressure on the U.S. government in order to get the focus to remain, on a genocidal state. Sudan really has suffered, I think, or Darfur has suffered from lately a sense that it's a chronic problem, rather than that it's a rapidly deteriorating situation. It's a sense of, well, they burned all those villages like Jon showed in his film, but that was a while ago, and now there are a couple million people in camps, and aren't we feeding them? So I think part of the thing that's really challenging for the U.S. government is, A, it's not going to be the country that's putting its troops on the ground, nor should it be. I think jihadis would likely follow an American troop presence. B, it's obviously very distracted with Iraq and other things at present. And C, it's been able, I think, to sort of tell itself that by basically doing diplomacy, by sending Deputy Secretary Zellick to the region
a number of times,
and frankly by comparing its performance to that of any other country on the earth, it's doing pretty well. But it's not doing well in terms of actually talking about what civilians need, and that's where we really need to ratchet up the sense of urgency within the administration.
Mudawi, very quickly, you, of course, have had your life on the line in this situation. You've been sent to jail 3 times, I think, in just a space of a year or so. Do you think the United States should be doing more than it is?
I think it should be doing more than it is doing in the right direction, because I think we have to learn from the experience of the CPA. that you have been pressurizing the Sudanese government and the rebels to get to an agreement. And this agreement have not been owned by the people, neither in the north nor in the south. I think the U.S. or any international community, they need to have involvement of nationals who exactly know what they need is. And we need to involve people at the grassroots level. I don't think the international community by themselves, they can bring any solution for the country's problems.
What about Arab countries? What about the Europeans? Are they doing enough? Should they be doing more? Are they more negligent than the United States has been?
I don't think the Arab countries are doing anything, because the Arab countries are siding with the Khartoum government, and they are always taking this official line. But for me, neither the Arabs nor the Africans can do anything more than empowering Sudanese people to get in, to protect Sudanese people, to own the process of making peace or bringing peace to the country.
Let's take this moment to move to another subject.
In 2004, a decade after the genocide in Rwanda, the international community vowed that it would not happen again. 5,000 African Union soldiers were dispatched to Darfur, plus another 2,000 police and observers. The force proved too small, too poorly trained and equipped, with too weak a mandate to enforce a ceasefire between Sudan's government and fractious rebel forces, a ceasefire all sides have flagrantly violated.
That was more from Jon Sawyer's film about his experiences covering the African Union monitoring force, 7,000 strong, that has, by all accounts, manifestly failed to keep the peace. Jon, in your observations of that force up close, what exactly was it that prevented them from succeeding?
I think they have succeeded, James, in some areas. Where they are, I think in some of the camps where they have a presence, in Niala and South Darfur, for example, where we watched and observed, went out on firewood protection patrol, where hundreds of women were able to go out and gather firewood without being attacked, or the incidence of attacks decreased substantially over the 3 or 4 months that they've been there. The problem is there are not enough of them, and they're not well enough equipped. There's no, the places that we were, the African Union officers were relying on their own cell phones to communicate. The helicopters were contract pilots, the people flying them. They didn't work on weekends, so that if there were incidents, you couldn't respond to them. And my sense is that they succeeded where they had sufficient force in place, and what I would like to see is to have more support go in immediately to take advantage. Not to say that they're a failure, but to use them, because they are. They're limited, but they're all we have right now. They're on the ground.
Michael Ranneberger, is it the view of the U.S. government that whatever other international forces might be sent into the region, and we'll get to that in some depth later in this program, that the African Union force should stay, or that it should be relieved of its duties?
Well, we've said that there needs to be a transition to a UN peacekeeping force. But the first thing I would say is that I've been to Darfur about 8 times, and I visited many of these camps. The African Union force has had a major impact in stopping what I would call the large-scale organized violence, by which I mean the systematic burning of villages. And it's not because, as some say, all the villages have been burned. I've flown over Darfur. There are thousands of villages. It's because their presence has had a deterrent impact. Now, has it been perfect? Absolutely not. There's still a tremendous amount of violence occurring. But that violence is more complex. You've got groups
How so?
Well, you've got groups of Janjaweed militias, clearly. But you also have a lot of rebel activity, more than there was, frankly, previously. You've also got bandit groups. You've got sort of undisciplined government military. So it's a very complex situation. And frankly, the African Union assets are stretched in trying to deal with that. So one of our objectives is, in fact, to intensify support for the African Union mission, try to strengthen it so it can deal with the situation until the UN can get on the ground.
Has the United States supplied money or logistics to the African Union peacekeeping force?
We've so far supplied about $220 million in assistance. We've got another $123 million request on the Hill in a supplemental that's pending.
And what country is next behind the United States in terms of support and funding for that AU force?
The European Union has provided about as much funding as we have to it. So we are together we're the principal supporters.
All right, let's take a question from our internet audience right now. This question is from Holly, and she wants to know, to what extent has U.S. involvement in Iraq interfered with U.S. policy regarding Darfur, and how can the U.S. balance its commitment to Iraq with working to stop genocide in Darfur? She says, I think that the United States and the rest of the world have a responsibility to do something. Samantha Power, do you think Iraq is, you mentioned this a little bit before, how much is Iraq crowding out our ability to act decisively in Darfur?
I think it's had a profound impact on our foreign policy everywhere around the world. When there was an opportunity about a month ago, it looked like, for the African Union to hand off to the UN peacekeeping force, the Sudanese government basically went door to door with a number of countries and said, almost like a PR agent, you know, if you like Iraq, you'll love Darfur. I mean, in essence, this is the quagmire that awaits you, and so it's raised the specter. I mean, countries don't generally want to go and offer protection in the face of genocide. It's not something states like doing, and it's not something their citizens reward them for doing. So when you can create yet another disincentive, I think that really hurts. And also, people have, around the world, I think quite unfairly actually, have heard the U.S. government's claims about genocide in Sudan as just part of an anti-Islamic, larger agenda about
crusade,
sort of
if you will.
a crusade about sort of whacking, Arab governments or Islamic governments. And so its diplomacy, I think, has been greeted with a certain skepticism, and its claim to moral legitimacy and to be upholding international law is obviously greatly weakened by the decisions it made in the run-up to the war in Iraq. So it's been a real problem. But again, if there were a community of countries other than the United States who were really concerned, you would probably see some of that melting away. And the kind of domestic movement we have in this country pressuring the U.S. government to do more, which I think has paid dividends, isn't actually evident in the rest of the world.
All right, time for us to turn once again to another subject. With the government in Khartoum directly implicated in genocide, its delivery of basic services naturally leaves much to be desired. This makes the role played by the United Nations, aid workers, and humanitarian organizations all the more critical. The U.S. and other countries have pushed for a blue helmet UN peacekeeping force, as we've been discussing, to replace the beleaguered African Union force. Sudan is balking at that. Once again, let's take a look at Jon Sawyer's documentary chronicling his recent visit to the scene.
Now the United States is pressing for the United Nations to take over the AU mission, with more troops and a stronger mandate to protect the civilian victims of Darfur. Sudan's government is balking, stoking public fears of an Iraq-style foreign intervention. Calls for further UN sanctions against Sudan, meanwhile, are stymied by the opposition of countries like China, the major purchaser of Sudan's newfound oil.
Mudawi, when we see scenes like that, is that just a reflection of the power of the government in Khartoum to stage manage public opinion and make it look like the public is up in arms against any UN force coming in? Or is there a real opposition in Sudan to the presence of white foreigners, essentially?
One thing we have to understand about the Sudanese people, we don't have anti-foreign sentiments. These are rallies which have been mobilized by the government. Sudanese people in the history, we are the only nation which paid a farewell party to our colonizers. We have been colonized by 462 British. We don't have anti-sentiment and anti-foreign sentiments. And you have all these people coming from Western Africa, living in Sudan, coming from Ethiopia, coming from Eritrea. We are not. You have the Coptics, for example. We don't have any, this kind of anti-foreign sentiment.
When the British were there in the 19th century, and the Mahdi rose out of Darfur, and he came to power, and he threw out the British. I mean, there may not have been an anti-foreign sentiment, but when there was an army perceived as an army of occupation, people rose up. And I certainly agree that the government has done everything it could to create these demonstrations, and they're trying to stoke anti-foreign sentiment. But if there is an army that is perceived as a Western, particularly if it's an American army that came in I think you'd see something similar to what you saw in Iraq, where I was in Iraq just before the war, and there was a sense that we would be perceived, as the Vice President said, as liberators. And we were for a few weeks, and then it quickly changed. And I think that would happen anywhere that you had a large-scale foreign presence on the ground.
I think the Mahdi had the revolt against Islamic country. It's Islamic State. It was against the Turkish. It wasn't against the British.
Michael,
the British came afterwards. But I think, for me, the problem is not troops, you know. You don't need troops in Sudan.
Right.
You need people to be engaged in a dialogue. If you have the African Union force with only 7,000, when they came and they stabilized the situation, they were very few. They were less than 3,000 people. They came and stabilized the situation where there was a negotiated, ceasefire. There was a hope that there is a solution.
Now, Mudawi has talked, Michael, about troops being able to accomplish only so much, and what you need is people on the grassroots level, if you will, or on the ground. You, however, or the Bush administration, I should say, are pushing for a UN peacekeeping force here that would be 12 to 20,000 men strong. What do we imagine that a UN force could accomplish by way of stopping the violence that's taking place, whether it's complex or organized or disorganized or what have you? It's there and it's happening. What do we imagine that a UN force could accomplish that the African Union couldn't?
Yeah. Well, as I indicated earlier, the African Union has, in effect, sort of reached the limit of its capabilities in dealing with this very complex situation. If you get a UN peacekeeping force in there, it will have more technical capabilities, it'll be a larger force, it'll be a better equipped force. Now, the African Union forces, however, would form the nucleus of that force. There would also be additional troop contributing countries. The way I would put it is this. You need an international peacekeeping force. Now the African Union, soon to be the United Nations peacekeeping operation, to stabilize the situation and stop the killing. The long-term solution to this, the only real viable solution, is a political settlement. And that's why we've been a very strong supporter of the Abuja peace talks. And it has been the United States, in fact, I've been watching this issue, I've been dealing with Sudan now for 4 years, that has mobilized really a very broad international coalition, including the European Union and virtually every state on the African continent, to press Khartoum and to support these international peacekeeping forces.
All right, let's go to our internet audience once again with a question from Laura, who asks, realistically, how long will it take for the UN to deploy a peacekeeping force? And she also asks about NATO. We're going to come back to NATO. Michael, once again, do you have very quickly, any ideas on how long it'll be before we actually see one? Obviously, the Sudanese government has something to say about this.
Right. Well, again, there are two parts here. One is to strengthen the existing African Union force, and that can be done immediately. We're already taking some steps to do that. In terms of deployment of a UN force, realistically, these things do take time. If a UN Security Council resolution was approved tomorrow, it would most likely be 6 to 9 months before a UN force was on the ground.
Yeah, the other point there, James, worth noting is that the United Nations is already in southern Sudan. There's a UN mission in Sudan that's already been approved. There isn't any of this dispute that we have on the mission in Darfur.
And how's it doing?
And yet, well, it's only about, I think Ambassador Ranneberger knows the number better than I, but I think it's about 70% there.
Right.
And it's taken much longer to get it up to speed, and they're not really doing all that they could, even though there's not the dispute about what role they should play. So you have to keep that in mind, that if you put all of your hopes on the United Nations coming in, then you may be not only kicking the ball down the road, but not having what you'd like to get at the end, as opposed to what you can do right now.
Now, there is another element to this, and President Bush has talked about the need for NATO involvement, what he calls stewardship of any prospective UN peacekeeping mission. On March 29th of this year, Mr. Bush welcomed President Obasanjo of Nigeria to the White House, and in a session with reporters in the Oval Office, offered his broad prescription for this crisis.
The President and I talked about Darfur and the Sudan, and I made it very clear to him that we're deeply concerned about the humiliation, the rape, the murder that's taking place against the citizens of Darfur. He agreed, and I want to thank you for your compassion. We talked and strategized about how to move forward, how to make it clear to the Sudanese government that there will be a international response in working toward a peace. We talked about a dual track, that the rebels must come together and negotiate with the government. At the same time, we talked about bolstering the AU peacekeeping force with a blue helmeted force, and I explained to him my desire to have a NATO overlay to make sure that force is robust.
Jon Sawyer, you've been to this region extensively. You've just heard the President's comments. Does this strike you as NATO in a post-Cold War era foraging for something to do, or do you think that NATO could play a real viable role here?
I would love to see NATO do something here. I mean, a couple of years ago, I spent a month in Afghanistan, and at that time we were waiting for NATO to come into Afghanistan. It took NATO about, I think, a year and a half longer than anybody thought when it was first discussed that they would come in and help with the effort in Afghanistan. This gets back to what Samantha was talking about earlier, that other countries have been, whatever you say about the United States response, other countries have been much more loath to commit people and resources. I remember in Afghanistan you couldn't get the Dutch to commit even half a dozen helicopters. They just couldn't come up with the money for it. And so I fear that if we put our hopes on NATO, as with the United Nations, that we may be disappointed, and that ultimately, if we want to do something to see this wonderful concern all across the country and the civic involvement in this issue, that you really have to put your focus on Washington, on this administration that the ambassador represents, and on Congress to act. And I think it's possible to do it in ways without committing ourselves militarily, but making resources available and getting them on the ground.
Michael, I imagine you have something you want to say in response to that.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say, I think it's important to understand how we see the NATO role being played. What we've said is the objective here is obviously to strengthen the AU forces on the ground, and then to facilitate a smooth transition. Where we see the role of NATO is a very limited engagement to provide technical and logistical and advisory support. So limited footprint on the ground, but something that could help expedite the strengthening of AMIS and then facilitate this transition to a UN force.
Mudawi?
I don't think troops are going to solve the problem.
What do we need?
We need people to engage on dialogue. Because if you put the people to be part of the solution, then they will be committed to have security.
So you're talking about the peace talks in Abuja, Nigeria, correct?
No.
Where should that dialogue take place then?
In Darfur, between the people who are part of the conflict.
Realistically, can we get people to talk and engage in dialogue when there's this kind of killing going on?
Yeah, they have to, because you have to stop the killing. Without, you don't need that kind of forces in Sudan. That is a country where you have 70 people who have been keeping peace in the Nuba Mountains since 2002 without guns. You have been, the monitoring, the CPMT, this Civilian Monitoring and Protection Team, which have been monitoring the cessation of hostilities in the south. There are 26.
But Mudawi, it also took how many decades to get to that kind of balance of power on the ground where there was a level of exhaustion, the level of killing had gotten to that place.
You need to pressurize the Sudanese government.
Right.
Because the Sudanese government is the one who is brokering the fighting over there.
Samantha, let me ask you something. Because we're taping this at the Holocaust Museum, one of the great debates that still rages about the Holocaust itself was, should the Allies, should the United States have bombed the rail lines leading into Auschwitz? And that leads in subsequent discussions of subsequent genocides to some, perhaps it's a misconception, and I want you to tell me if it is, that the United States doesn't really need to rely on NATO or the United Nations, but the United States personally itself can take action, direct military action to negate what the government in Khartoum is doing and what the Janjaweed are doing. Is that true, or is that a complete misconception that just, for example, by aerial power, that we could intervene to make a real difference?
No, I mean, I think that one has to be very careful. Every intervention, when one is talking about military intervention, is a cost-benefit analysis, and it's the costs and benefits to the people whose lives that you're contemplating trying to save. It's cost-benefit in terms of American lives. It's cost-benefit to international law, to regional stability, to the rest of Sudan, to the North-South agreement. I mean, there's so many elements, and sadly this cost-benefit analysis wasn't done adequately on enough axes with regard to the war in Iraq. Had you done that kind of analysis with regard to Rwanda, I think it would have cut very much in favor of acting, given the risks, given the kind of international consensus you might have been able to muster. But Rwanda happened, of course, very, very quickly. What I find very disturbing in a way about our kind of hum-de-dum discussion and even the President's very welcome remarks is the idea that now we're talking about a bridging force, and we're talking about a very disciplined, short-term engagement, in order to support the African Union, in order to hand off to the United Nations. And we've been having this kind of conversation now for going on 3 years. People are still dying. The conflict has now spread over into Chad. Fine that the engagement has to be limited, but who is going to staff this United Nations protection force? We want to export the hazard. We in the United States, we as a sort of group of public intellectuals, yammering on a Monday night about what should be going on in Darfur, but who is actually going to comprise that force? Ambassador Ranneberger talked about going to the usual suspects, making the African Union the backbone of that force. Well, those usual suspects, the Nepalese, the Bangladeshis, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Ghanaians, the South Africans, the Senegalese, these are the kinds of countries we're talking about asking to come and do this kind of work. Well, they're active already in peacekeeping around the world. There's 75,000 of them doing this kind of humanitarian work. When are the Europeans actually going to step up and stop simply, taking our security umbrella, not spending any money on policing or on kind of ramping up their own services so they could actually perform these kinds of roles? And Mudawi, while I agree with you totally that we need to create a space for these communities to come back together and that's the only long-term solution for this place, if you go into those camps and you talk to those people about what they want, they would love to talk to the Arabs who are attacking them eventually, but only when they feel that they're not going to be attacked when those talks occur. And there is a desperation for an outside presence, and even sadly for a non-African presence, on a logic that while the Africans can do what they have done, there is a need for much more mobility and much better training and much greater numbers.
But aside from logistics and military, you actually think that white men with blue helmets can actually serve as a positive influence here, and that they won't be resented purely by virtue of the fact that they're Europeans?
Well, you've got to get the diplomacy right. I mean, part of what the United States has to be doing, in addition to denouncing and talking about the need for other countries to go and put their troops in harm's way, is peeling away Sudan's allies. And this gets to Mudawi's point. Peeling away the support they've been getting from the Chinese and even from some African governments, peeling away members of the Arab League, launching a joint fact-finding mission where you bring the Egyptian foreign minister with the Jordanian foreign minister together with Secretary Rice, into the conflict to try to enlist support for a much larger force. I mean, all those countries are saying they want peace in Darfur, so using their own words against them and saying, look, we all have an interest in having a thicker, much more robust force, creating the conditions by which, these communities can actually interact, both in Abuja and, at a grassroots level.
I think the presence, even the presence of the humanitarian workers in the camps is enough. It's a protection.
But why are they still being attacked?
Are the aid workers protected?
If we can force the Sudanese government not to
keep killing, right? And how do you do that? What is the system?
That is the pressure you have to do.
Well,
that is the pressure.
I was in a camp in Dali in North Darfur near Tawila, and 18,000 people were there in September, and it was completely abandoned. The aid workers had left because it had been attacked. In that case, it was attacked. Sometimes there are attacks by rebel groups, but in this case, they've been attacked by Jon Sawyer and by government of Sudan. And the African Union that was nearby had no arms. They were unable to protect, and so the people all left. So the aid workers left as well. That's happening all across the region.
Michael, please, let's have the ambassador speak, please.
No, but it's important to keep in mind that the actions that have been taken, and I think in this discussion it conveys the perception that somehow the situation is every bit exactly as bad as it was. The situation has changed. In 2004, there were 100 humanitarian workers on the ground. There are now 14,000. Malnutrition rates have been cut in half. The mortality rate, according to the latest World Health Organization study, is less than international crisis levels. That's not to say the situation is not horrendous.
You said a genocide was still occurring.
It is horrendous.
Is a genocide occurring?
It is occurring.
So we should be speaking about it with greater urgency.
Here's why it's occurring. Killing is going on. Rapes are continuing. 3.5 million people are affected by the conflict. And these African tribes are being targeted. Yes, it is still genocide. What I'm saying is that the actions that have been taken have not been totally impotent. Things have happened. Have we just discovered the UN? No. We've been talking about this for quite some time. And in terms of isolating Khartoum, I think we've done a fairly good job of it. Remember, President Bashir was deprived of the African Union presidency. And believe me, that was largely
Michael,
our handiwork.
how much help is Sudan giving the United States in the war on terror? And is that playing a role in our policy?
I will tell you the cooperation has been good, but it has...
How so? What are they doing for us?
Well, I'm not going to get into details here, but there has
Al-Qaeda,
been...
they're helping us on the trail of Al-Qaeda?
Well, there's been, let me just say there's been cooperation, but here is the point on that. And I want to tell you, I've been in some very high-level discussions at the very highest levels. There has never been a discussion of a trade-off. In other words, what we have said consistently is, look, we're going to try to have this cooperation because it's in our national interest. Are we going to lessen pressure or lessen our efforts on the other issues, on Darfur in particular? Absolutely not, even if it were to jeopardize the counterterrorism cooperation. The Sudanese maintain that in their own self-interest.
It's perhaps worth noting, if only for the benefit of the audience here, that Osama bin Laden spent about 5 years in Sudan in the early 1990s. Let's take another internet question from our audience on the web. Kristen asks, short of the United States being involved militarily in Darfur, are there specific alternative interventions we can do? She lists cutting off aid to the countries that are supporting the oppressors. Is there a way to show the world that it is beneficial to them to stop the genocide? Mudawi. Well, what would you do? You talked about pressure on Khartoum just now. Can we work through other governments to pressure Khartoum, and how would you recommend we do that?
I think I might have different views on these issues, because for me, pressure for Khartoum government means pressure for Khartoum government. We have to differentiate between pressure on the country, making,
Deals or trades.
Deals of trades, or pressures on the individuals. For me, which is working is the individuals. The sanctions on the country is only led the way for countries like China to come in, support, invest, and then allow Khartoum to do whatever.
So sanctions don't work, you're saying?
It doesn't work on the country level. It works on individuals.
It punishes people, not regimes.
Yeah. It punishes people, it punishes not, and it doesn't punish the regime, and at the same time it opened the way for countries like China to come in and then support the Sudanese government.
So how should we be putting that pressure on Khartoum that you've just mentioned? What's something practical we can do? How can Mr. Ranneberger pick up the phone tomorrow and put pressure?
Enforcing a no-fly zone. You can do that. This is one of the resolutions of the
a no-fly zone like we used to have in Iraq. You're talking about.
You can do this. If the Khartoum can be, forced not to fly by military helicopters or by military planes to Darfur, that is. But
that requires a military presence in Chad or somewhere to do that, which would be, since Chad is in the process of falling apart, it's quite complicated. But there are other things that we can do. You mentioned China. I mean, Hu Jintao, the leader of China, is coming to this city. I believe it's on Thursday. He's meeting with the president. I know that we have said that we would like China's help, but the president has an opportunity, quite visibly, when the two of them are together, when they have the standard joint press conference, the president can turn to Hu Jintao and say, your major supply of foreign oil is from Sudan. You have been obstructing efforts to put international pressure on the government of Sudan for 5 years now.
But John, you know very well that Sudan, unfortunately, is not the only pressing situation in world affairs right now, and aren't we dependent on the Chinese in some case? For example, our diplomacy trying to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Aren't we limited in the extent to which we can say to a single other nation that is as powerful and important, a member of the Security Council like China, to press them so hard on a given issue when you need their help on another one?
Yes, you have to consider the full array of issues that are before us, but I think that if you just engage the world community, if you sort of put it out there in the open and you're talking two of them together. I mean, you're saying, we have a serious disagreement on Sudan that you are, in effect, you are facilitating the Sudanese government to continue on a path that is highly dangerous to millions of people in part of that country.
And if he did that, if President Bush did that when the President of China visits, what kind of cooperation could we expect from China at the UN Security Council on an issue of great importance like Iran?
Well, I think that in that case, too, they'd have to look at their own self-interest, as they will in this case. But I think the Chinese are sensitive to not only world opinion, but to the opinion of their own country, to the people in China itself. Part of it is you're seizing that opportunity in a non-military way to bring the issue before the broad world public.
Ambassador Ranneberger, let me ask you one question here.
Yeah.
Are there initiatives that the United States could have undertaken, either diplomatically or otherwise, that you personally wanted to see us undertake and that we did not?
I'll tell you, I'm sure I could think of one if you gave me enough time, but I first became involved in this issue in August of 2002, after Jack Danforth had been appointed special envoy. And I've been working this issue very hard, and I'll tell you, it has been a full court press. And when we talk about conflicting foreign policy priorities, I will tell you Sudan is one of the top several issues that the administration has been pursuing. And I think one reason, and on the China point, it's an absolutely important point, we have had a very intense discussion with the Chinese, and we will with the President when he arrives, on Sudan. And I think one of the reasons we've seen the Chinese be somewhat responsive, we're not there yet, is because we've done such an effective job at mobilizing this multilateral pressure on the Sudanese government.
Why aren't they more responsive? You just said they've been somewhat responsive. What's your analysis of why the Chinese aren't more responsive?
Well, we haven't fully tested the proposition. I think when we go to the Security Council for a UN Security Council resolution to endorse peacekeeping, that will probably be the most significant test.
Do you think the Chinese are acting out of economic self-interest here?
Well, I think they're acting out of economic self-interest in terms of their relationship with Khartoum. They do have oil interests there, and of course there are natural resource questions. But I think that by the same token, cooperation to end the violence in Darfur is something that's in their national interest. They want to be seen as a responsible global partner. And we've made this a significant issue in the senior level dialogue with the Deputy Secretary.
Very quickly.
Ambassadors mentioned Jack Danforth's role, and that's how I got first involved in Sudan as well, because he represented Missouri, and I was working for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at the time. And that's one thing we're not doing quite the same way now. I mean, and I think one reason I was able to go back to Sudan and get in with the African Union was because both sides, the Sudan government as well as the Southerners who came into the government of national unity, they had so much respect for Jack Danforth. And Danforth spent 2 or 3 years essentially knocking heads there and just working at it, very pragmatic. And I think we've kind of gone off in a different direction since we're putting pressure on the United Nations, or we're talking about NATO, we're talking about things on the outside, and we don't have somebody of Danforth's stature who is out, there day in and day out.
We have a powerful forum right here. Is there anybody whose name you would like to place into nomination to replace him?
I mean, Danforth himself, you get him to come back. I mean, people have talked about Colin Powell. I'm not so sure. It has to be somebody who has a lot of visibility.
Who are some of the other names that have been mentioned besides Powell? Anybody else that comes to mind?
Clinton.
Bill Clinton.
Yeah, Bill Clinton would be one.
Yeah, I mean, he, to this day, there's not a single member of his administration that he apparently interacts with without saying, how do we allow the Rwanda genocide? How did it? I still don't get it. How do we let that happen? It just doesn't make any sense. He can't wrap his mind around it. But instead of having that conversation, obviously it would be politically very difficult for President Bush to enlist him, but Kofi Annan in his final term could potentially enlist him as a UN envoy, which would be a little, as he did for the tsunami relief. I mean, he is somebody who's got a vested self-interest and a true capacity to make people see commonality that they didn't see.
But also, it gets to Mudawi's point also about the need for dialogue. You need somebody there. I mean, I spent a day with a tribal reconciliation conference in south of Nyala, and this was a grassroots effort, a great family organization, and that particular one didn't succeed. But there is a great desire to find that space, and I think that we need to have somebody who is over there, and I think Clinton's a wonderful idea, somebody that has that kind of stature.
You need an envoy to give protection for the process itself. Somebody who can, stand in front of the Sudanese government to allow this kind of grassroots.
But wouldn't the Sudanese government paint any U.S. envoy as a representative of imperialism, as someone who's here's the U.S. and here in the person of Bill Clinton or whomever, and try and paint that person as they are going to try for regime change and so forth?
If he's appointed by the UN, then we can cut this short. A UN envoy is an American, but he's a UN envoy.
Of course, it also bears saying that the appointment of Bill Clinton as a prospective envoy to Sudan would not be without its own domestic political consequences here in the United States, especially as we head into a midterm election year. I want to move on at this point, folks. We mentioned earlier that the Sudanese government has so far refused to allow the deployment of a UN Blue Helmet force, which would be larger and in theory could do more to pacify the situation than the African Union force that has been there for some time. This raises the question of what can be done to change the behavior of the regime in Khartoum. We've already been discussing this a little bit. Or whether the greatest need is for a change of the actual regime there. Michael Ranneberger, you probably have heard about this from the inside. Has anyone talked at all about regime change in Khartoum in the Bush administration?
Well, the whole point of the policy, of course, is transformation in Khartoum.
Not transformation. I'm talking about change of the regime, not behavioral change by the regime.
Well, transformation is in effect, change of the regime. And here's why I say that. We've said this very clearly, and Jack Danforth has said it, we've all said it, that the Comprehensive Peace Agreement puts in motion a democratic process that, if it works, will in effect lead to a democratic system in Khartoum. That means you will not have an Islamic fundamentalist government in Khartoum. Now, that's not something that happens tomorrow. They have a right to compete in an electoral process. So that is underway, and what we did as Darfur became an issue, we linked Darfur to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and said the two things had to move forward together in order to maintain, to improve relations with us. I did want to add one quick point. On the envoy issue, I don't want to leave the conversation without making very clear that we do have, in effect, an envoy in Deputy Secretary Robert Zoellick. I mean, he spends an enormous amount of his time on this. Has traveled to the region repeatedly and has the most, has very constructive conversations with President Bashir, Vice President Taha, Salva Kiir, all the players.
And it's true that he's visited sites in the Darfur area beyond the sort of normally trafficked sites that VIPs visit. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I've been with him up in the Jebel Mar Mountains. I mean, yeah.
Samantha Power, I want to go to you. Should we be trying to effect actual regime change in Khartoum? From your remarks about Iraq earlier, it sounds as though perhaps you would think that Khartoum might have been a worthier target for regime change efforts than Baghdad.
I mean, I'm a great believer in Colin Powell's pottery barn rule that if you break it, you own it. And if we don't have an appetite right now to staff up in South Sudan, we the world, that is, not we the United States, to actually shore up that peace agreement where there's actually a peace, and when we have barely an appetite to equip 5,000 African Union troops and a couple thousand monitors, the idea that we're prepared to dislodge the regime and own Mr. Mudawi's country seems to me very far-fetched. So rather than raising expectations and so on, I think really thinking about where are the travel bans on Sudanese government officials, where are the asset freezes, for all of the allegedly constructive conversations with Sudanese officials, they're not that constructive. We're still seeing people dying, and now again there's major spillover into Chad. I agree totally that Deputy Secretary Zoellick has really made his presence felt, but it is spasmodic. I mean, by definition, he's got a huge portfolio, namely the globe, to tend to. So there is, I think, a difference when you have somebody of his stature, which is enormous, and I have to say no other in the entire 20th century. You never saw somebody at the Deputy Secretary of State level deployed to do this kind of diplomacy. So I really do credit him. But I think ultimately the peace process, we all have to be very honest, it's going no place fast. And right now the African Union, again, for all of the allegedly constructive conversations we've had with African governments, have hinged the handover to the UN on the securing of a peace settlement in Abeche. So the linkage now between protection and politics, or protection and a settlement, is something that we have to actually break so as to ensure that we can actually enhance the protection, ramp it up, and that in turn will then have a constructive effect on the peace process, hopefully.
Very quickly.
We also need to recognize how fragile the North-South agreement is, this comprehensive peace agreement that the Ambassador is talking about, that yes, it would transform the government if all of its terms came to pass. But if you talk to just about anybody in Khartoum, or certainly in the South, the expectation in the South is that in 2011, when under the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, they can vote on secession, they anticipate that they will secede. And so we're looking at separation of the country, not transformation of the North, unless we somehow invigorate that process. And that gets back to Mudawi's point about dialogue and sort of our being involved on the ground, bringing all factions together.
All right, we have to leave it there, and we're going to move on to another subject. 16 months ago, the Sudanese government signed this comprehensive peace treaty with southern rebels to end the 21-year-old civil war, out of which the Darfur crisis grew. Ongoing peace talks in Abuja, Nigeria, have stalled over issues related to the disarmament of the various factions, oil wealth, and so forth. Are all the people at the table who need to be at that table in Abuja, Mudawi?
Unfortunately, no.
Who belongs there that isn't?
In the history, the Sudanese government have always been fighting by proxy, using local conflicts. These are real conflicts. And those people who are fighting They are not fighting because of the Sudanese government giving them weapons. They are fighting because they have their own conflicts with the local communities, and the Sudanese government is just granting them immunity, not to be taken to the courts. So, without bringing these people to the negotiations, you cannot actually do peace.
Is it your view that the talks in Abuja, however successful they might be, will never necessarily have an impact on what's happening in the western region in Darfur?
I think it's going. If you sign a piece of paper in Abuja, it will be a piece of paper. The level of violence is going to increase.
Samantha Power, your view of the Abuja talks so far?
I mean, very, very tricky process, because you have rebel groups splintering by the day. As Mr. Mudawi said, you know, we're not actually including in the process the Janjaweed. We're assuming that the Sudanese can rein them in, which I think is probably wishful thinking, in that, I mean, I think Sudan can have a profound effect on their behavior, but whether they could, you know, sort of call the Janjaweed to heel at this point, given how long and how much time has passed, I think it's wishful thinking. I think that until you get a stable security situation, or a relatively stable, a more stable security situation, people are necessarily going to gravitate toward those they feel can protect them. And if it's not going to be the African Union or a UN force or European countries joining an African force, then it's going to be rebel groups and Arab militia. So to think that we can do politics and do Abuja without getting this protection piece right and the security piece right, I think is truly wishful thinking.
We're closing in on the end of our program. Michael Ranneberger, a question I wanted to ask you. We really haven't focused enough in this discussion on the role of the Janjaweed, which are the armed militias backed by the Sudanese government that are carrying out the majority of the atrocities here. Where are they getting their ammunition, their weapons from, their money, their financing? If you tell me it's from the Sudanese government, where are they getting their weaponry from, their hardware?
Well, first of all, let me address that, and then I want to make one other comment. They're getting support directly from the Sudanese government. There's no question about it. They also capture weaponry and all of that. Now, the Sudanese government has fairly large oil revenues coming into it. And until at least the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed, they had free rein to use all of those oil revenues. So weapons purchases, their defense budget is a large percentage.
Who are they buying their weapons from?
They buy it from the Chinese, the Russians, and other countries. So it's a combination. Now, there is a UN arms embargo on Darfur that we ourselves helped to achieve through a UN Security Council resolution. So that has somewhat limited the impact. But one point, and I think this is a crucial point.
Quickly.
On the Darfur peace talks, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, it's moving ahead too slowly. It does create a context for a peace agreement in Darfur. That process is slow. Mudawi's absolutely right. It does have to have a component of dialogue within Darfur. But the level of U.S. engagement here is what makes this viable. $1.3 billion a year of U.S. aid going into Sudan to support that comprehensive peace agreement and humanitarian relief. That is one of the largest aid programs of the United States in the world, bar none. So, tremendous level of engagement. That's what gives us a chance to move ahead.
All right, we're at a point in the program where, unfortunately, we have to give each of our guests a chance to summarize their final thoughts. We will begin and proceed in order of the arrangement here on the stage with Ambassador Ranneberger. You will each have about a minute. What can you tell us that you haven't had a chance to say already?
Well, I think, again, watching this process, look, I went out to Darfur in January of 2004. We heard reports of what was happening in Darfur in 2003. The rebels launched these attacks. The government launched the Janjaweed. I flew over Darfur. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was like a scene out of Armageddon. Villages burning as far as the eye could see. As a result of that, and that's sort of ground truth reality, I was very pleased that the administration moved so quickly. Within weeks, we had sought a resolution in the UN Security Council. It ended up being a presidential statement. President Bush was the first leader in the world to speak out. We've passed 4 UN Security Council resolutions to maintain pressure. We have put billions of dollars into support for the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and humanitarian relief. 85% of humanitarian relief is being provided by the United States. So the one thought I would leave you with, the level of U.S. engagement is tremendous. And again, I repeat what I said earlier. It is what lays the basis for stopping the violence completely in Darfur and to achieve a political accord.
Jon Sawyer, journalist who's been to Darfur many times, produced a documentary about his experiences there. Your final thoughts?
I agree the level of engagement is tremendous. As we said before, it's more than any other country, but it's not enough. And my sense is that I feel that a year or two ago, we somehow went off track. That I think that we had the process, I think, was a very good process. And the idea of building up the African Union, using the African Union troops as a force to deal not just with Sudan, but with many other conflicts that have arisen across Africa that we're not really equipped in Europe, the United States, to go in and do ourselves. It's far better to use Africans, to have Africans staff up and have the ability to do that. I think we were on the way to having that happen. I think we didn't quite commit enough resources. We were not quite successful enough in persuading the Europeans and the Japanese to write checks as well, so that that money could be done. The African Union could have been the bigger force. I think it's still possible to do that, and I'd rather see us seize that opportunity than spend a lot of spinning wheels, in effect, trying to get a resolution or in the United Nations or doing something with NATO. I'd like to see us build on what's there and increase the presence on the ground and make the space possible for the kind of dialogue that we've talked about here.
Are you headed back to that country anytime soon?
Hope to go, but I'm not sure when.
Okay, Jon Sawyer, thank you. Dr. Ibrahim, Mudawi Ibrahim Adam, please, you're headed back to that country sometime soon. You've been in jail 3 times over there. Do you fear for your life when you get back there? And your final thoughts, please, as well.
The risk is always there.
The risk is always there, you said.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing I always say that, you know, troops never solve this problem. An international community cannot solve our problem as Sudanese. We need the international community to assist Sudanese who are working for this without protection, to protect them, to negotiate a peace deal. And peace is always negotiated while war is going on. You cannot speak about security and peace. You speak about security and insecurity is there. So you have to negotiate. People who are fighting, they always come and negotiate. You cannot disarm anybody without his will. You have to get him to this negotiating table. He has to be part of it. He has to feel he is part of the solution. The international community can make the environment by pressurizing the Sudanese government to allow this to happen, by putting more effort, by assisting, by protecting Sudanese to involve in the process. I hope we don't make it wrong again, that the CPA have been negotiated under pressure, and now it's not going anywhere.
Dr. Mudawi Ibrahim Adam, we're all impressed by your courage, genuinely, and we wish you well when you go back to Sudan. Finally, author and Pulitzer Prize winner Samantha Power, your final thoughts.
When the U.S. government began talking about a NATO bridging force, I went to see a very senior French official, thinking that since the French had a lot of action going on in Africa, that they'd be a good place to start, to get a rundown as to who in NATO actually might be interested in supplying advisors or equipment or troops. And as I went through each of the countries that comprise NATO, I got one answer after another was no, I don't think, no, not them. And then when I got to the Canadians, this senior French official said, oh, no, definitely not. After Rwanda, I don't think so. And so one of the things that's so amazing is all these students who are out there in America who've put such sustained pressure on the Congress, which in turn has put such sustained pressure on the executive branch of the Bush administration, legitimating the efforts of people within the State Department who are trying to get this to move up within the ranks of the bureaucracy. All of that effort is so significant and it has to be sustained, but we've got to figure out a way for governments to learn the lesson of Rwanda and not just domestic political constituencies, and we haven't yet found that way.
Samantha Power, thank you very much. Thanks to all of our panel members for this enlightening discussion on the crisis in Darfur. The verdict of history will take many years to render on whether the United States, the Bush administration, the world, international community has done enough to end this crisis. One thing we do know is the crisis continues. For more information on this subject, feel free to visit the website of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. That's www.ushmm.org. For all of us tonight, I'm James Rosen of Fox News, your moderator. Thank you for joining us.